na campana ngana ne ponya banonye ya male nolongo pa yo oh jingara oh badoman oh jarame oh jungayo.
Yep, freak out and burnout, that's very common things that can happen. There's a big influx of people coming in and wanting to do this work and then leaving again because it becomes full on, and there are so many, I mean, when you go out to a lot of the communities, like Ukwela is quite different from a typical community, but it can be very intense work, and there's a lot of issues and there's a lot of things going on there, and there's a lot of people really hungry for that stimulation, and you know the white fellas come in and have all this stuff to offer, and then the more they give, the more that they want to take it, and the more they want to get involved, and the more, and so it just becomes this hungry kind of like frenzy of, so the burnout's a very realistic thing. So I think you just got to know how much you can give, but you've also got to really take time out to, you got to have your little luxuries, like a comfy pillow if that's your thing, or some nice food that you bring out for yourself, and you got to take your time.
I go work in a small community, that's fine, but after a certain time, my time is mine. I think for your own well-being, I think you need to have some sort of boundaries. So you have to say, unless it was a direct emergency, you don't come over to my house past 9 o'clock.
When you go to a community and you're doing work with young people, it can be, because it's another culture and because you don't know the rules and you don't know the language, your intelligence is really stretched, your mind is stretched, and you're emotionally stretched, so you can feel really fatigued from it. So I would advise anyone who first moves to a community not to go with plans to do something in their spare time. Because you're so immersed in another culture, you might not actually have the time that you think, because you might think, oh, my job finishes at 5 o'clock, but at 6 o'clock in the evening or 7 o'clock you've got someone knocking on your door. Now, a lot of white fellas might say, well, I'm not going to open the door because I'm not being paid. Now, a lot of white fellas get really emotionally exhausted from demand sharing, because Aboriginal people, as they build a relationship with you, will ask you for something. They'll go, Amy, can I lend $20? Amy, can I have a cup of tea? Amy, can you take me out getting firewood in your car? Okay. So you might end up doing all these favours for people and find yourself really exhausted. But as you do those favours, you're also building relationships, and you can ask for favours. And this is a really, really important thing, because if you don't ask for favours, you're going to end up feeling used, and you're going to end up feeling depleted.
I think mob, like the way they bring up, there's not, typical white fellas have a real big sense of boundaries, and they have that sense of respect. They're taught to be like that, and to if someone says no, you say no, but these kids will be like, nah, but, because they're not, it's a completely different culture, and it's brought up really differently, and like, things that I've learned, like, we've had times where we've worked and done the recording and stuff in our house because we didn't have anywhere else to do it, and then that meant that when we wanted them to go, so we have lunch and have a break, then they didn't really want to go, and some kids got really mad and they locked us in our own house, and it was the only way out, and we had no phones, and we found this radio, and we CC radioed some truck drivers along the road who had to come and let us out of the house. So it was pretty funny. We were a bit worried at the time, like, we're like, far out, this is pretty crazy, but things like that can happen. So I think having your own private space that's your...
And you could argue the point that, I'm part of the community now and that's my rightful place. Well, okay, but I'd also argue that you were never really part of the community. You've worked your way into it. You've come there as a worker, and sure, you can blur it up as much as you want, and they don't see you as a worker anymore and all that kind of stuff. That's great. While you need to be friendly, you're not there to be friends, and it can be difficult sometimes with the young people. But if you if you blur that your working relationship too much, I think your boundaries get blurred too much, and then you become an inefficient service provider. Build those relationships first, but you can be very clear about how far you're willing to take those relationships. So for instance, you're working in Alice Springs, you see your clients, you know, a lot, so you see them all in town, and you know, you run into them at the supermarket, that's fine, like that's okay. But you know, my client group that I work with, I would not be seen socially. Now, and I would say that would be very unprofessional if I was. And the fundamentals, never lend your client any money. You know what I mean? Don't engage them on a personal level where you're actually starting a social relationship with them. Obviously never drink and do drugs with your clients. I mean, I had a young client, highly violent, disruptive anyway, he lived by himself, and the lady who was his caseworker was a heavy smoker. Now she used to come over and smoke cigarettes with him. He had a lot of anger management issues, but what would happen is he'd run out of cigarettes. So he'd just go postal, but he wasn't saying, I need you to come over because you're going to help me work through some situation. He was thinking, I need you to come over because you have cigarettes. Highly controlled, dangerous substance. It's a cigarette, for Christ's sake. Particularly with young people, is don't change your direction. So to say, if you said no one can smoke in the van, then not when you're just with one young person, don't let the one person smoke in the van because no one else is there and they won't know. So you need to treat everybody, you know, fairly.
So it's very hard for me to take on a position of authority in a culture where I don't know the rules. But what you might be able to say is that I'm the one who opened this youth centre. I'm the one who's supplying the basketballs tonight. There is no fighting in this space that I'm the one working in. So there's no fighting inside the disco hall. So if you want to fight, go outside. We don't fight in the disco hall. Okay? So in that way, you're not stepping over your level of authority. You're just saying what you can have in that particular little space.
I think stricter can be good and down the line's good, but I think, you know, they're not going to like you too much if you're just a big bossy boots, and then they will not respect you and they'll cause you trouble. And I think if you can win their respect over so they really value what you do and who you are, that's a really good sense of advice, because then they will, you know, the older ones and that, you know, that they're not going to want to come and cause you trouble or do your stuff as much. Like, yeah.
That humbug of having your door knocked on is often a real opportunity to engage. It's an opportunity to welcome someone into your house, to have a cup of tea and to show that you, just as you've been welcomed as a guest into their community, you will welcome those people in. Now, at some point you're going to need to strike a balance, because everyone will start to think that your house is a cafe and you have endless cups of tea. But
a dog-eared cafe.
Yeah.
They come over for dinner, so they get expectant. So you're not really, they've lost the focus of you as the worker. You're the dinner provider. Or if you smoke cigarettes and you're consistently handing out cigarettes to your clients, when they want to see you, part of them is thinking, I want to see them because I know they have cigarettes. I don't think anybody should ever go hungry. And, you know, if someone showed up at my door, well, I'd first think, how do they know where I live? Fundamentally, if they say, oh, I'm hungry, I'll go and buy you something. Always, and I'll always have. Doesn't matter what country I'm in. So that's not so disempowering.
I've been winging it here.
humbug is this idea of, Blair, can I have your cup of tea, please? It's requesting something. It's anthropologists describe it as demand sharing. And in desert culture, people used to demand share. So they would see someone who's got meat or bush food or something, and they'd say, can I have half? And that goes on continually through our Aboriginal communities. People will demand, blankets, they'll demand money, they'll demand food, they'll demand a ride in a car. Okay, so it's a request for a sharing of a resource. But you can't demand that somebody does a job for you. Okay, you can't say you have to pick up all that rubbish for me. That's not demand sharing. But if you have a bag of rubbish, you could always say, can I have half of your rubbish? And that person would have to give you half of their rubbish. For youth workers who come to work in town camps or Aboriginal communities, it's actually a really important thing is to realise that you need to go to those places with the same sort of attitude that you would go to if you were going to visit a country like Indonesia, or if you were going to go and work in a village in Papua New Guinea, or if you were going to go and work in a village in Mongolia or Afghanistan, because what you're actually doing is you're going into another person's country and another person's culture, and you're actually going into a part of the world where the language that you speak is not the language of that place. It's like a foreign language. Back in the old days, before the intervention, when you needed permits to go onto Aboriginal communities, it was like you were getting a visa to go there. And part of the really important thing of that process of applying for a permit and then getting a permit is that you realise that you were actually a guest on someone else's land, and that was always in your mind that your permit could be revoked.
You need to let things be a lot of times, so particularly around soy business and different family interactions and different skin colors and stuff like that. And you can ask some basic questions, but then if you don't understand it, sometimes it's not appropriate to seek an answer at that time, and that's actually quite disrespectful. So you might go and talk to someone who was not involved in that overall situation, like, hey, and put it into a different context.
I emphasise a lot of Aboriginal culture, and I just assumed that coming out here, and especially going up into the bush communities, that I would be able to sit down and watch a ceremonial dance, and to sit down and be told all about these stories from the elders. But in reality, those stories are, you're not, as a white fella, non-Indigenous, without much trust or relationship building already, you can't expect to have the most secretive parts of Aboriginal culture just dished out to you willy-nilly. You've got to earn that by developing trust within the Aboriginal community.
What communities are is they're an interface between the white fella Western world and the Indigenous world. And it's not just a simple matter of the white fellas come in, do all their jobs like mechanic, store manager, postmaster, school teacher, and that we can just train up all the Aboriginal people to do these jobs and then walk away. Because there's actually a whole bunch of complexities in Aboriginal society. Knowing who's related to who in a community is almost like going to a city and working out where the bank, the post office, the grocery store is, the petrol station is, because those are things in our white fella world that orientate us to how to operate in our society, whereas in Warlpiri or Pintupi or Indigenous cultural world, the way that you orientate yourself is through relationships, how families relate to each other, how people relate to each other, and it can take you a long time to learn. There's avoidance relationships where people can't even talk to a certain group of other people, where they can't even be in the same room as a certain group of other people. And there are relationships of obligation where people can't say no to other people. So if, John has a car and his brother-in-law Fred says, "Can I borrow your car?" John can't say no. Even if Fred wants to do the wrong thing with that car, even if that's a community-owned vehicle that Fred really shouldn't let John drive, even if John doesn't have a licence. Situations that are really quite culturally difficult for an individual person to do can be managed through that by cultural partnership.
Stand up and be counted. Are you